Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Not Every Emergency Has to Be a Disaster. I'd like to welcome you all today and hope that you find the conversation and discussion interesting and useful. Before we start, I'd like to give a brief introduction to CWSI. For those of you who don't know who we are, we're an Irish company founded in Dublin in 2011, and we are leaders in managing and securing hybrid work, or I guess you could just call it work these days. We've grown both organically and via acquisition over the last 12 years to now cover 5 countries, Ireland, UK, Netherlands, Belgium and Luxembourg. We have a global base. Obviously, we have a lot of multinational companies HQ'd in Ireland, large public sector and private sector customers across Northern Europe and the UK. And our specialization is in managing and securing hybrid work. We work both direct to market and via channels. We have channel partnerships with most of the major telcos and a lot of the major distributors and systems integrators in the various countries in which we work. We're also a founding member of what's called the Enterprise Mobility Experts Alliance, which is a loose alliance of European organizations like ourselves who specialize in the area of hybrid working, mobility and security. And we use that as a forum to share information and collaborate to help us provide solutions in the different markets. Purpose as a company is pretty straightforward: to enable the world to work securely from anywhere. To expand on that, what we mean any application, any device, any network without compromises. And what we mean by no compromises is no compromise on the user experience, but also, and just as importantly, no compromise on the security and risk management. We have a 2-step approach to working with customers based around our get secure and then stay secure. We don't see security as a point in time. It's a continuous program. But on the get secure, we do quite a lot of work around helping organizations develop and implement their security and compliance strategies. A lot of that is made up of doing maturity and security and risk assessments to understand current state, and then look at doing relevant solution designs, implementation designs to help them get to their target state, and helping them and then potentially managing those deployments or providing assistance to deploy those various solutions and programs into our organizations. And then on the stay secure side, we provide a variety of different managed services around the key areas of devices, identity, applications, and data to help organizations stay secure and keep up with the constantly changing environment that is modern device and user and applications. Some of the key areas that we work in are around the area of compliance. We do a lot of work around compliant communications and collaboration. This is where we just help organizations ensure that they can be compliant across all forms of collaboration and communication, including things like instant messaging, Teams, WhatsApp, mobile and fixed line, potentially for areas like in the financial sector, like for MiFID II, or for other requirements where all communications need to be recorded and monitored for compliance. We work heavily in the area of data governance around insider risk, data classification, data security and retention, and also around DLP and information protection, primarily for cloud assets. We also work on the key pillars around identity and access management, threat protection and cloud security, and on the operational side in the areas of the device management, endpoint management, and the logistics around managing fleets of various types of devices in a secure manner, and also around how to securely develop and deploy applications in an enterprise environment. That's a little bit around CWSI. I'm going to introduce myself now and a bit about my own background, and then I'm going to invite Professor Omand to introduce himself, and then we will get into the meat of today's discussion around how to survive a crisis based on Professor Omand's book, but talking primarily in the areas around resilience, emergency and crisis management in kind of all areas of organizations, governments, and more that will develop as we chat. So a little bit around myself. My name is Paul Connery. I'm the CWSI Client Solutions Director. I've been working in security and IT for over 20 years, with CWSI for about 9.5 years now. I primarily work in the areas of data security, compliance, particularly around the areas of insider risk, data classification, and DLP. Mostly working at a kind of a strategic or senior level with organizations, helping them develop those programs and implement them according to their strategies. Mine is a brief introduction. I'm going to leave a little bit more time for David, because his career is quite, there's a lot to talk about there. So I'd like to invite him now to introduce himself, and then we can jump off from there into today's discussion. David, if you'd like to go ahead.
Thanks very much, Paul. I'm Sir David Omand. I'm now a visiting professor at the Centre for Intelligence Studies at King's College London, which is a second career following a full career as a public servant in UK defence, security and intelligence, including being the principal private secretary to the Defence Secretary during the Falklands War, being the director of GCHQ, the UK's signals intelligence or cyber intelligence and security organisation, being its director at the dawn of the digital age. I was permanent secretary of the Home Office. And finally, my last appointment was to be the first UK security and intelligence coordinator in the Cabinet Office after 9/11. I've been a non-executive director of a FTSE 100 and FTSE 250. I've been the senior independent director of a FTSE 250. So I have some experience of some of the pressures that difficult circumstances can give to commercial organizations. And what I've done is draw on all those experiences in my recent book, published in the summer by Penguin, How to Survive a Crisis, Lessons in Resilience and Avoiding Disaster. I wrote the book to highlight the urgent need to improve our national resilience, including our cyber resilience, in a world that I think is going to be full of ever more disruptions, capable of plunging companies and, I have to say, governments into crisis. So we're going to have to adapt to thrive in a world of global vulnerability, not least because of our dependence on complex supply chains, for example, that themselves increasingly rely on digital networks and technologies. So I'm delighted to have this opportunity to have a conversation with Paul, because surviving crisis is not just a technical challenge for a company, or it's certainly that, but in crisis, every aspect of an organization is going to be tested, from investor relations to customer loyalty to corporate communications. So Paul, let's have our discussion.
Brilliant, and that's a fantastic introduction. I can hope at some point that I'll be able to do something similar, but I doubt it. We've had such a very interesting number of different careers, I think, over your time, and I think all of that experience really comes across very well in the book. I've been enjoying it quite a bit, quite a lot of little notes in there and some takeaways. But I think as a good place to start, it would be good to maybe set some nomenclature or some framework around the kind of areas that you talk about there in terms of resilience and organizations. I think one of the key things that you talk about early on in the book is the difference, and knowing the difference of when you're in an emergency and when you're in a crisis. So maybe you could expand on that a little bit, and potentially, work it into some of the examples you give, maybe around the WannaCry or NotPetya or the Colonial Pipeline type elements. But I think that'd be a good jumping off point.
Yeah, if you go into any bookstall in an airport, particularly in North America, you'll find shelves filled with books on something called crisis management. A cynic would probably say, and I'm not a cynic, I'm a realist, but a cynic would probably say, you don't manage crises, they manage you. So in the book, I've adopted a more nuanced sort of approach to say there are emergencies, there are crises, and for some, sadly, there are disasters. And we have emergencies all the time, certainly in corporate life. And this, as you believe me if I say that in government, there are emergencies, every day. But most of those get dealt with. There are contingency plans. They may not cover the exact circumstances, but people are used to adapting their plans. Certainly, if it's one of those emergencies caused by, floods or fire, then there are emergency services that can swing into operation to protect you and protect the population. But crisis is different. My definition of crisis is when events are hitting you with a frequency and a depth that mean your normal processes for dealing with emergencies simply don't seem to work. And as time goes on, more problems arise. Some of the measures that you take to try and get help turn out to create even more problems, like closing schools in a pandemic creates no end of problems for people. Although at the time you may think it's the only lever you have. So in the book, I describe what I call the rubber levers test, so that in that crisis period, every lever you pull it's made of rubber. It doesn't seem to be connected to reality on the ground. Now, the trick is, of course, having spotted in advance the kind of things which might happen, having made some basic plans and preparations, perhaps run a few corporate exercises just to test out how you would manage. The crisis period can be really very short. Then it simply becomes, yep, we've just got to get on, we've got to manage it, we've got to get the supply chain working again, unblock the problem that with communications or whatever it might have been. But if you haven't, and this is the big lesson in the book, if you haven't done some of that basic preparation, the risk is it just gets worse. And that's when you risk that slide into disaster, where in the corporate world, you discover that your competitors have actually eaten all your business whilst you were out of action through, struggling with a ransomware attack or whatever, or the market that you thought you'd establish and which has now been turned upside down by a revolution on the other side of the world. You're hemorrhaging cash.
Yeah. And
nothing you can do in the short term seems to make it any better. So that's the slide into disaster. So the short answer to your question is I see a crisis as sort of poised between emergencies on the one hand, may be very painful, may even be people killed or injured, certainly financial loss, but copable with, they're under control. And on the other hand, the disaster where you haven't managed to survive the crisis. But in the middle, I say you've got this period where if you've thought ahead, if you've anticipated the kind of things that might happen, done a bit of investment in resilience, then you can find your way through, you can survive that period.
Okay, and that's kind of the arc of the crisis stuff that you talk about in the book in terms of knowing where you are on how crises develop, right?
Yeah, I mean, the arc of crisis is, we know where it starts because it starts with something very unexpected.
Something bad.
And it's normally on a Friday afternoon, probably after most of the key staff have already left for the weekend.
Bank holiday weekend.
And then suddenly the phone goes, or whatever it might be, the mobile rings. And boss, we've got a problem. So you then go through the next part of the arc, which is genuine uncertainty about what the hell is going on. And establishing some solid situational awareness, particularly if it's something you haven't prepared, at least in general terms, prepared for,
Yeah.
can be very tricky. But eventually you get that, and then with luck and a following wind, you can probably get your hands around the problem. The key to that part of the arc of crisis is communication.
Yeah.
Communication to your investors, saying what you've just read in the Evening Standard or the Financial Times, this is what is really going on. Communication to customers, saying, yes, our website is out of action. You're not going to be able to place any new orders, but by next week we'll be back in business. So keep faith with us. And it may be communication with the public, and that's certainly true for the government side of it. What are you going to tell the public? And of course, it needs the preparation of a communications plan, which is, you want the elements of that already as in being, and the senior executives knowing who's going to front up the communication effort. Will it be the chief operating officer? Will it be the CEO? If there's a board structure, do you actually wheel in the distinguished figure you chose to be the chair of the board and say, you had better go in front of the public?
Yeah.
And no plan will obviously fit the circumstance. So you need the elements of a good communication strategy and somewhere to run it from. Will it be corporate headquarters with the right kind of comms? And then that awful sinking feeling, how do we manage business continuity if our corporate headquarters is underwater or the building next door caught fire and we're not allowed back into our own building? That's got easier.
Yes.
Indeed, thanks to works of companies like yours, that has got easier because you can use the cloud. You can make plans to operate more remotely, which we wouldn't have been able to do even a few years ago.
I think one thing, I'd agree it's got easier on the one hand, but I think there's a risk on the other hand that there's so many vectors of communication out of organizations now. We've all seen in public sector and private sector things getting leaked via WhatsApp or being put out on social media. So I think your communication strategy, it is something, it's a core element of a good security management, crisis management program. You have to kind of think of top to bottom. Obviously there's I think a lot of people will spend time, what do we tell the markets if they're a publicly traded company, or what do we tell our citizens if they're in a government? But you also have to think, how do we ensure, what do we tell our own employees, and how do we make sure that they're going to go home and talk to their wives and their families and their friends, and that, and how do we make sure the message gets managed at all levels? I think that's something that maybe doesn't always get as much attention, particularly when the crisis can happen at the graveyard shift junior employee. If you haven't done the training or the prep for them to know what to do in that scenario, to push that up the line, you run the risk of something, the road not traveled by there. You could go down the wrong direction very quickly and start moving away from your emergency towards crisis again, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I put a chapter in the book with a whole lot of, at the end of each chapter, there are a practical list of practical things you can do. And on communications, I mean, there are some very basic lessons which most people know, but quite a lot of people forget when suddenly the adrenaline is flowing. I mean, one is that the first information to arrive after some event or incident or whatever it might be is almost certainly wrong in major respects. I will never 7/7, the bombings on the London Underground and London Transport, because explosions happened in a tunnel. The tube stations on either side of the explosion reported there had been an explosion. So the initial report is you've got double the number of attacks that you, in reality, and it takes time to sort that kind of thing out.
Yeah.
So there have been some quite spectacular own goals where the very senior people, ministers, or in one case, the Commissioner of Metropolitan Police, went on air with information which by the time they were on air was actually out of date. And of course, thereafter, the media will go for you because they will be saying, we were misled. You know, it's in good faith, the information. So you have to be very careful about that. On the other hand, the examples I've seen where companies just keep stum and they just hope it's all going to go away or it won't be as serious as the initial reports indicate, that can go wrong very badly because they're accused of being secretive. And this is particularly true. I mean, if you remember the Macondo oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, where, you know, with the best will in the world, the companies concerned were slightly spinning the story in the hope that it wouldn't be as bad as perhaps it could be.
Yeah,
and of course,
or get to the next news cycle, just pass on by.
It became clear on the next news cycle that oil was pouring out into the Gulf, the credibility of the corporate sources starts to erode very fast. And then the politicians jump on the bandwagon and you're heading for, well, if not disaster, certainly a very, very big problem and eventual financial loss. And coming back to the arc of crisis, don't think that it's all over when you've finally restored, you know, order and you've got control of the situation and remedial work is in hand, because there will have been some damage done. It could be to confidence, it could be practical damage to plant and machinery, whatever it might be. So there's a period where there's quite a lot of time will be needed to get things back on the road. And the final stage, of course, if you're unlucky enough to, if it's an industrial accident and people have been hurt, for example, there'll be inquests, there'll be inquiries. If you're government, you're probably going to face several very public inquiries. And so I always advise, you know, people to keep very careful records, honest, truthful logs that you can provide. What is so embarrassing is when, if you do have a serious incident and an inquest, for example, is held and they demand to see the WhatsApp messages or equivalent, and it's stuff you would not ever want in the public domain. So, I mean, it sounds so obvious, yet you just open the newspapers and you see examples where people weren't thinking where things might go. Coming back to the arc, one of the really, I think, the tests of whether an organization is tuned up for the unexpected is the ability to mobilize. Because as you say, if it happens on the Friday night and the junior team is on duty over the weekend, it's quite unfair to expect them to carry the full load. But, you know, the chief executive's on holiday. Are you going to pull them back? Are you going to take the very best people from every aspect of the business, people that you know really good at managing problems in difficult circumstances, and say, right, drop everything else. This is now the priority. We've really got to put a maximum effort. And then with a bit of luck, a week later, fine, you're over the hump of the arc of crisis. But if you don't, and you know, in political terms, I mean, this is the equivalent of Boris Johnson not attending the first 4 or 5 Cobra meetings when the pandemic started.
It's a gamble, right?
He may have had very good reason to be doing other things. At the time he was the Prime Minister, busy schedule. But it doesn't convey the kind of public, help inspire the kind of public confidence that the management are on the case. And that sort of mobilization and getting all the people in the company or the organization to realize that something quite important has happened, and this is now the priority to fix, rather than life goes on, people are dealing with second or third order questions and busying themselves as they normally do, whilst the organization's facing a genuine crisis.
I think it's interesting. There's always an opportunity cost, as you say, to getting your best and brightest and diverting them from what they're doing to go look at something that could or could not be a crisis. But I suppose, going back to what I commented about, it's a gamble. If you don't do that, you're gambling every time. That's not a crisis. So it's probably better to have procedures in place to quickly establish the facts and the situation with the best people that you have. So, the shortest period of time is spent in that gray area, and you can get as quickly into actually dealing with the crisis. Would seem to me the most cost-effective way of doing things, even though people will argue you are impacting other parts of the business for something we're not sure of. A couple of things you spoke about there. I'm thinking again, particularly in a cyber attack type situation. One of the things you said that's absolutely key earlier on is accuracy of information, and the fact that the early facts, facts that you are given are likely to be inaccurate or wrong or exaggerated. That area of intelligence and getting good intelligence and being able to kind of analyze that and cut through that, is that something that you see organizations taking on board for very fast-paced type and often very complex type of things like a cyber attack, where they can be multifaceted? There could be misdirection, they could be attacking in different areas. In terms of some of the events that you've analyzed or come across, have you seen that being handled well, or have you got any examples of or suggestions or recommendations around that area?
The very good examples are where the company, or let's take government, where government has spotted this kind of thing could happen, and then before it has happened, and they would have no idea when it will happen. Most of these, everything from exploding volcanoes to flash floods to terrorist attacks, you don't know when it's going to happen, but you've got a pretty good idea that there's a chance it might. And that's when you identify the information requirements. What would I need to know to take sensible decisions about what to do? And that's when you write that down and you make it clear that this kind of information you either expect to be collected routinely, or somebody to have done the hard work of looking at what would be reliable sources for that information that's going to be needed. And I mean, it's little things that can trip you up, such as data definitions. So if different bits of the organization are working off slight, perhaps following mergers and takeovers and so on, they've got slightly different approaches that they've inherited. When data suddenly starts to pour in about what the impact is, if you haven't done some preliminary work sorting that out, it's going to be very confusing.
You could drown in the noise,
and misleading. This happened during COVID. So the national health hospital trusts and so on are producing information which is necessary for government to take decisions. But if the information coming in from different parts of the structure is all on slightly different definitions of what is meant by a patient on critical care or whatever it might be, again, it can be very misleading. So there's now a big effort in government. There's a special unit set up in the Cabinet Office to think through, if these kinds of events happened, what information would we need to be able to manage the situation. And does it exist? Is it easy to get? And if it isn't, then let's put the spade work in now before it happens, so that we will be ready. There are plenty of case studies of, particularly take one specific example, which is, does the organization hold personal details, either of staff or of customers, including bank account details, home addresses, which can be, for some people, very sensitive.
Yeah, we've seen that with the PSNI here in Ireland, for example, with all our data being leaked. You see that's an operational risk to those people.
So if there's a cyber attack, has that kind of information been lost, or hasn't it? I mean, it's perfectly possible in this PSNI case that you could have had information put out, but most of it wasn't, so establishing whether you've lost information that is genuinely sensitive, and certainly in Great Britain, in the UK, the Information Commissioner's Office is going to get pretty upset if you've lost citizens' personal data, including bank type data and addresses, and you haven't confessed to having done that. So the first temptation may be to say, well, yes, we've discovered there was a penetration of our network, but we don't think anything is missing. And then when it eventually comes out that, yes, this data was not properly secured, it wasn't compartmentalized, it wasn't encrypted in the right kind of way with access controls and so on, that's when the Information Commissioner's Office is going to start handing out quite large fines. And the office, they've been very clear that if organizations have done some due diligence, if they've thought about it, if they've made taken reasonable steps to safeguard personal information, then they'll take that into account in trying to assess whether there was negligence and whether there's a fine. But if the organization, it then turns out, hadn't recognized that this information was likely to be sensitive, that's when you're going to run into trouble.
Yeah, and I think it's the old adage there, really, of perfect is the enemy of good. Really, like, I think it's better to have done as much, some planning and some contingency work and put something in place than to just bury your head in the sand and pretend it's not there, because again, the regulators take a dim view of that approach, and your chances are massively increased that the impact will be more significant. I think it's interesting you mentioned about the data definition piece. I attended a Cyber Ireland conference last week, and there was attendees there from CISA from the US, which would be kind of the equivalent, I guess, of the NCSC here in Ireland and the UK. And there was a gentleman there from ENISA, from the European side of things. And some of the key areas that they're working on in parallel with each other is around that data definition piece, because I think, as was mentioned, police forces are actually quite good at this. We have good relationships at Interpol, Europol level. They're quite good at sharing operational data. They have a common language for the most part, discussing about criminals and about intelligence that's relevant in that arena. But at the cyber defense level, it's something that is still very in its infancy, and there's can be very large differences between even different countries within the EU, never mind between the EU and the US or other agencies or NATO and those different areas. So I just found that quite interesting. That's an area of focus for them at the moment, is to work on getting those data definitions to be better. And then the other key one, the key focus from the CISA side in the US, and it's something that they've seen has become more critical, because their public sector or their public infrastructure is actually mostly private infrastructure. So they're much more reliant on the private sector for their critical infrastructure. So they're focusing on forcing reporting and getting better reporting from industry on what their readiness and posture and risk position is, what processes and procedures they put in place, and most crucially, when they do have an incident or an alert, that they share that as quickly as possible so they can get that intelligence, so they could see, is this an isolated attack, or is it something that maybe is affecting multiple organizations? Like, for example, something like that would have been quite useful in the WannaCry situation, where it just kind of exponentially spread really, really quickly. And it was probably pure luck that it didn't do as much damage as it did, because one security researcher started playing with some stuff. So I do think it does seem to me that it needs to be a national or a multinational approach to kind of, I wouldn't say force, but encourage private sector organizations to put in place things like good alerting and good kind of security hygiene and contingency planning.
I agree.
To get better at this sort of thing.
And I mean, the sort of case that the EU has been worrying about could happen at any day, is that, you know, a new strain of malware that is exploiting a particular vulnerability, for example, in a financial system, hits member country X, but exactly the same system vulnerability exists in member country Y. What is the mechanism that could, in confidence, tell the banks in country Y that this is a problem? The finance sectors are pretty good at this now, obviously because of the level of risk exposure that they have, but that's not true of other parts of the critical infrastructure. And so much of it rests on trust. So I think we've got this pretty well organized now in the UK, where the National Cyber Security Centre is part of GCHQ. They're used to handling secrets, as it were. Breaches can be shared with them in the knowledge that competitors are not going to be told that company X has just been done over by some North Korean group, and that will get out into the market and create havoc. So you need the trust that information can be shared in confidence, it can be anonymized. What then goes out to the sector is just simply, there has been a vulnerability now uncovered, so attacks are likely in this particular, and here's the technical details, so the CISOs can get on with fixing it. You can do that nationally, and I think NCSC has now got that reasonably well. When it comes to European sharing, and indeed with North America, elsewhere, it gets obviously tougher. The more countries you add, the more risk that the confidentiality arrangements won't be fully understood all the way around the system and so on. But it's got to be done. Clearly, it's got to be done. Otherwise, the criminals, particularly cyber criminals, but also hostile states, will have a field day.
Yeah, I think that's the key as well. I think it's possibly going to be easier with the cyber criminal side, because again, it's similar to the policing. It's a policing matter essentially. But when it comes to, you know, state actors, well, then I guess you're into a much more complicated web of who's friends with who, or you know, there's going to be someone who's going to want to sanitize or look at any information shared before it gets shared, which is going to slow everything down and potentially exacerbate the situation, right?
Yeah, and it takes you into quite tricky areas like attribution, and you know, when do governments call out the North Koreans or the Chinese for some particular set of attacks, and when is it actually better not to reveal your hand? Just quietly make sure that that entry point is blocked off and they're expelled from the relevant networks, without creating a sort of political firestorm.
Yeah, I think not to dwell on this area too much, but I think one other thing that struck me in that conversation was an area of concern is non-government actors. So, for example, we saw with Ukraine that there was an invitation, hackers of the world, come help us out to defend us against Russia, which is, I suppose, a noble cause, but as was being pointed out in the discussion last week, what happens if citizens in country A, directly attack infrastructure of another country? You have this attribution problem now, and this could almost be considered a hostile act, and it's very hard to potentially disconnect that activity from state activity if the state isn't like actively trying to shut these people down. It could be seen to be encouraging them. So it was an interesting discussion that I hadn't considered as an area of concern before, of how situations could get out of hand.
Yes, yeah. The other distinction, which is difficult to make, is, was this state activity, which you assume as state authorized or at least connived at, but was it for espionage? Was it to steal trade secrets, for example, or just to do reconnaissance of the power grid of the northeastern United States? Or was it actually phase one?
Yes.
Of preparation for future attacks, and have poison pills been left around the network to be activated as and when the hostile state might want that? Yeah. And paranoia can, you can get quite paranoid about this very quickly. So far, most of it seems to be basic intellectual property theft or old-fashioned espionage rather than deliberate sabotage. But you can't help feeling that with critical infrastructure these days and reliance on web services and cloud services and so on, if it ever came to a major conflict, there would be a strong incentive to shut down quite a lot of that, just to make life difficult for the victim.
Yeah, but we saw that with Ukraine, right? We saw the preparatory attacks in 2014 and 2017, and again prior to the invasion in 2022. So it's not outside the realms of possibility. I think it's one of the reasons we're seeing a lot of focus on the new networks infrastructure security directive, the NIS2 directive in Europe. I think there's an equivalent piece of legislature going through or in place in the UK, and
not
the US
quite yet, I think.
Pardon?
Not quite yet. I think the
yes.
EU got slightly ahead of the UK on that. We already had one from 2018, but the EU has produced an updated NIS2, expanding the number of types of activity that get caught by the directive.
Yeah.
So it's not just the very traditional critical infrastructure suppliers. The UK, of course, post-Brexit, you're caught by this since you're sitting in the Republic of Ireland. We're not, but I am expecting the UK regulatory environment to catch up. And so I think we'll probably end up in the same place. It actually makes quite a lot of sense to do so.
Yeah, I think it kind of has to be almost a global strategy at this point. You would think. I definitely think it'll probably align quite closely with stuff that NATO would want to do as well. But I find it interesting that NIS2 one is, when you look at some of the stuff in there, you expect to see power, and you expect to see maybe critical pillar banks, insurance. These all kind of make sense from your but things like waste management, that was an interesting one that's been expanded into the area that no one had ever thought of before. But then I suppose I have vague memories of the waste collection companies in Naples going on strike, and the city being choking in rubbish and stuff like that. So you could see quite quickly how things could break down if that infrastructure was attacked, and as well as the obvious stuff like water. So I think it's interesting.
Well, that happened. I recall vividly being in the Defence Private Office in 1979, and we had the so-called winter of discontent, and we had rubbish piling up in the cities of the UK, black plastic bags, which were rubbish spilling out. and the dead were unburied because the grave diggers were on strike as well. And that did for the government.
Yeah.
The government, it's again, it's one of these crisis management lessons. You have to be able to show the public that you are going to get control of the situation. And the Callaghan government simply couldn't. And the famous headline in the Sun newspaper after Prime Minister Callaghan returned from Guadeloupe, there'd been a summit with the US, and he came back looking sort of tanned and smiling. And the media simply piled into him. And the Sun headline was "Crisis what crisis?" ? Which Callaghan never actually said, but it summed up the public mood at the time, which was the government doesn't seem to realize, we're actually in a crisis here. So it did for Jim Callaghan, and that's when Margaret Thatcher swept into power.
Yeah, so it's interesting. You could see how someone could manipulate things like that now to cause instability during an election period or stuff like that. And there's some attribution potentially. You mentioned Brexit, to things like manipulation through social media and those kind of areas. Whether that was a serious factor in the vote, we probably will never know. But with our modern societies, I think there's so much more scope now to manipulate things through cyber to
and
have
even if it's not manipulated, the mere broadcasting on different social media that the company's in trouble or whatever it might be, and that spreads like wildfire, gets exaggerated even if there's a germ of truth, and it creates a new reality, which is how people are now going to think the situation is. So it's quite difficult decisions to know, do you rebut every false accusation you spot on social media? Do you actually set up a team to monitor what social media is saying if you've run into a bit of emergency or possibly a crisis? Probably it's quite wise, but you can expend so much energy trying to knock down casual tweets that are misinterpreting the situation. But if you let some of these stories just rip, then it creates a reality. And that will shape the way that everyone, from investors to customers and so on, begin to think what the situation actually is.
Yeah, I guess we're back to where we started in terms of managing communications management being one of the very prime elements that you need to consider in the early stages. I suppose just to build on that, in terms of, and I like the way you've done it in each section of the book, you have your kind of bullet point kind of suggestions or recommendations in section at the end of each. I'm a practical person at heart. I like that when I'm reading a book, things are summarized in that way. In those first 24 to 48 hours of a emergency / crisis, where are the key, elements of focus? Obviously, we've talked about communications management as one. What are the other kind of key areas that I think we've also briefly mentioned? Intelligence gathering, that you would think organizations, whether public or private, should focus on?
It's summed up for me by kind of mobilization. So, I mean, when I was the UK's crisis manager, security and intelligence coordinator in the Cabinet Office, when things happened, I was quite brutal about, you press the button. And if it turns out it's not as serious, at least you've given the whole system a bit of an exercise.
Yes, yeah.
So you've got to be, can't overdo it, obviously. People do have other work to get on with. But that sense of mobilization, that it's not just the C-suite that knows there's a problem, but it's, the organization knows that something's happened, that as you mentioned, communication to your own staff. So when they go home, they're talking to their families, giving the message. This is where sort of some prior preparation, reading the book, going through the list of do's and don'ts, really helps, because you'll have a kind of either a mental checklist, or you'll actually have written it down on a bit of paper so you don't, or a spreadsheet so you don't forget it, of the things you ought to check off, you know, investors, customers, key suppliers. Obviously, it depends on what kind of circumstances hit you, but basic stuff you've got to get right. A tricky one is whether if there's been a serious incident, do you keep people in post? And you know, these days, all sorts of things reputational problems suddenly arise. Do you send people off on gardening leave? Do you replace them? Sometimes, and certainly I've experienced this, the best person to put something right is the person who caused the problem in the first place. So somebody, you know, goofed, but, you know, if you trust them, then they've learned an expensive lesson. They know where the problem is, and, you know, to rescue their reputation, you know, they'll do everything in their power to put it right. But sometimes you might have to say, that was a mistake to have that person running that particular bit of the business. We've got to put in somebody else, in which case the lesson I draw in the book is do it early. Even if, you know, the advice that'll come up from HR and so on is, well, don't rock the boat just at the moment, and etc. I think being decisive, which is a general point about which I make in the book, that it's very rare that I've come across circumstances where people have said to me, oh, I wish I hadn't done X or Y. Most of the evidence that I collected when writing the book was, I just wish I'd done X or Y earlier.
Yeah, that really strikes me from everything we've been talking about, and from reading through the book as well. You know, the being decisive across all areas earlier on, you're better off doing something than nothing in some cases. Now, that it doesn't always going to work out, but it's better to be moving than standing still. But I think the key, from what I can understand, from what I've observed myself, I guess, in being able to be decisive, is the more preparation and planning and practice and training you do, the easier it is to be decisive. Would that be fair enough?
Yes. You know, no two circumstances will ever be the same, and it's a mistake to imagine you can just pull a plan out of the cupboard and follow it when something happens. So, you know, flexibility, ability to improvise is essential, and that would be true of any bit of a business. But I think this sense that if you worked out the kind of issues that are going to land on your desk and the kind of decisions that in a crisis situation you might be called on to take, it's much easier to take them. It's that awful, I'd no idea that I might have to make a decision as to whether to close this down or whatever it might be. It's that much harder. And the temptation to, well, let's take a decision on it now. Can we have some more options, and etc. When actually the answer is you should have thought about, had some sense in advance that that's the kind of decision I might have to take in a crisis. And, you know, it's not such a surprise that it suddenly popped up and I'm going to have to take it.
I think organizations can be very good at elements of that. So I think most organizations will have a pretty good plan for what to do in the event of a fire or a flood, or you know, these kind of even though they're actually quite rare in many cases, they're traditionally what planning has been based around in disaster recovery, business continuity. Those are the kind of, civil unrest, maybe pandemic. I think, there's definitely pandemic planning out there in some organizations, hopefully a bit more in public sector. But one thing that strikes me is by the area of cyber attacks, technology-based attacks, is still seen as a niche area, and there's probably one or two areas of the business that do planning or try and do planning around it, but the response to a cyber-based attack or disaster still needs to be similar in many ways to the response to a kinetic or a physical disaster. And I don't think that maybe businesses invest enough time bringing a whole of business planning and training and approach to a cyber attack. I don't know whether that's something that you might comment on.
Yeah, I think it's what you've just said is so true. And it's my observation as well. There are obviously exceptions. Some companies have kind of taken the old ideas of business continuity and melded it with cybersecurity and cyber survival. But that's not what I see as the generality. I still see the cybersecurity is a technical business. The general management doesn't really need to understand it. Somebody else will come and fix it, or if it's a smaller company, they've got a link to an outside supplier, a cybersecurity company who can come in and tell them what's happened and fix it. What they don't think about is that the very act of that attack could create, real problems for the business. And therefore, as you say, it has to be an all of business response. And all the stuff I put in the book about continuity, business continuity with investors and customers and suppliers and so on, all of that could apply in spades. If it doesn't really matter that it's a cyber incident that has hit the company. Fact is, the company can't deliver its product, and the product's going to be at least a month late. Yeah, that's a business issue. It's not sorting it, of course, is a cyber issue, but it's the business issue that will make or break the company as to how well it handles it. Very good example, I put a chapter on this in the book, is Maersk, the world's largest logistic company that got hit by the Russian NotPetya attack. They weren't targeted, it was a spillover of an attack on Ukrainian companies, but they had an office in Odessa, I think. So they got the malware into their system. And they'd made a crucial system design mistake, which was automating the backups. So being a huge logistic company with millions of containers filled with billions of dollars worth of goods traveling all around the globe, the heart of that is information about what is in every container and where's it come from and where's it going to by which route. And if you lose that information, you're dead. And they did lose it. And of course, because their automated backups were simply very regularly to different centers around the globe, backing it up, the backups got infected. So suddenly there they are facing wipeout. But what is so impressive is that they were able to mobilize the whole company, contact all their customers, reassure them that new orders would be taken, that the ships that were traveling around the world, they could actually access what container manifests and so on, and sort of build up, not quite an analog, but enough to keep them going for the few weeks that it took to get the system restored. I mean, the wonderful story here, which I think is true, is that there was only one copy of their custom-built software to run all this information that survived, and that was, I think, in Sierra Leone, because there'd been a power cut
Yeah, the office was
and
offline.
therefore they were offline. So they managed to rescue that hard disk, get it back to the UK where the recovery team was working at Maidenhead, and from that rebuild the system. But that took time, and in that interval they were doing everything they should have been doing in terms of continuity management, and survived. But it's touch and go. Now, you don't want to be reliant on a bit of luck, like one bit of the system being offline, to survive. So there are lots of lessons, but one of the lessons is about mobilization and about communication and making sure that the bread and butter of the business, you can keep going, at least in a limited form, whilst the techies sort out the problem, which eventually, of course, they will.
Yeah, I think that that difference between continuity and recovery is something that's very important, and something that not all organizations get right, because you know, the technical people will just want to fix the problem, but they may not be experts on the business, and they may not realize that the actions they take to fix the problem could have impacts on the business. So there has to be I think that whole scenario has to be played out and discussed. As you say, you can't have a plan for everything, but you can still put some parameters around some basic scenario planning and say, well, imagine ransomware is common now. Like we've some statistics here. 50% of businesses in Ireland have been hit with some kind of cyber or ransomware attack in the last year. I think similar statistics in the UK or across Europe. It's not a, you know, you could go 30 years and your warehouse could never go on fire, and you'll still be paying for fire insurance and doing fire drills and doing all those things every year, when you're more likely going to be hit every year, or at least one every second year, with a cyber attack. So it's just interesting that the same investment and effort, I don't think, goes into protecting against that level of attack.
And if you've made the mistake of paying up to get the data released, then you can guarantee that you'll be hit again within a couple of years.
Yeah, and they've got very sophisticated now. We have the double and triple type attacks where they'll make you pay to get your data back, and then they'll also make you pay so they don't release your personal data to the web, and then they will release your personal data to the web and just sell it. So they get paid 3 times. So it's
interesting too. Some of those, some of the companies, like logistic companies, for example, that rely on information, the criminals will hit them with a classic ransomware attack and lock up the data. But quite a lot of companies, the data they've got, they can survive without. What they can't survive is having it made public.
Yeah.
So they get hit with a different kind of attack, which is essentially an extortion.
Yeah.
We'll reveal your sensitive information on your negotiations for the takeover of another business, and you're negotiating it. We'll put all that out on the web unless you pay up.
Yeah. No, we see.
So they are becoming much more sophisticated in how they target.
Yeah. Like we see. Yeah, like law firms will be massively concerned over, because so much information about their clients and negotiations being held on their systems. They're a nice target. Unfortunately, we've also seen in the last couple of years attacks that are actually having real world impacts. Like it's not only worrying about the bottom line of a private company we're talking about here. We've had the HSE, which is our equivalent of the NHS here in Ireland, which and also the WannaCry itself impact, even though it was paused, it still had real life surgeries were cancelled, patients removed. It's quite probable that there was sickness and death as a direct impact of those kind of attacks, and hospitals are actually a fairly common target now, because they have a high propensity to pay, because there's such a real impact of their systems being offline. So I think it's a tough. It's easy to say don't pay the ransomware, but it's a very hard position to be in if you're a CEO or a CISO, or you're a managing director of a hospital, and someone has encrypted all your systems.
Yeah, but I think certainly the UK, the official advice is still, talk to the National Cybersecurity Centre. Don't immediately think about paying up. And
Yeah,
the colonial pipeline attack in the United States, a classic where they paid, but the disruption that that attack caused landed on the door of the government.
yeah.
How are you going to keep fuel supplies going in the whole east coast of the United States after this attack?
That was an interesting one. Go back to the communications as well, right? Well, because there was a suggestion that the pipeline was going to be shut down and there would be a shortage of oil. It caused a shortage of petrol because everybody ran to the nearest gas station to fill up their car and essentially did a DDoS attack on the network.
Very true.
Unintended consequences.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I just want to talk about a little bit more, post-event, I think you touched on this a little bit yourself, like, so there's the arc of the crisis, and you mentioned earlier on. I think it's very important that lessons are learned, whether it's a near miss or an actual hit, and whether you handle it well or handle it badly. So like root cause analysis, I think is very important. And I also think it's an area that, going back to the information sharing, I think that will be another key area that organizations should share that information. I think it was one thing I think the HSE here in Ireland did very well is they produced a very detailed report of what happened, which did air some dirty laundry, I guess, for them in terms of you could see where they broke down. I think you mentioned in the book around the WannaCry piece that there had been some risk assessments on about 80 or 90 of the NHS trusts, and I don't think any of them had passed. And they had all their systems were running very old versions of software. So I think it is important to not just do these assessments, but to learn from them and share that information. And I think that's an area that we possibly could be better at.
I agree. I mean, I sometimes use the term adaptive resilience. The classic view of resilience is, the organization has a shock, something has happened, and it bounces back, which obviously is what you want. But do you want it to bounce back in exactly the same configuration as it was there before? Or actually, do you want to, in the course of managing the crisis or whatever, do you want the lessons to be learned quickly and then applied? So when eventually normal life continues, you're actually stronger than you were before you had the experience. I mean, it's the classic about, electricity substations built by the Edwardians, on floodplains. Then you have these days a flood. When it comes to renew it, you put it on a hill. You don't replace it where it was. That's a real example from the floods in the west of England a few years back, where the city of Bristol was only just saved from complete months of blackout by the military building a wall of sandbags around this electricity substation. The flood water got to within a few inches of the top. And that would have been Bristol without electricity for months. So kind of thinking where are the vulnerabilities. Now, I think the problem comes certainly for government is how many of those vulnerabilities can you afford to fix? Or do you wait for the replacement cycle?
Yeah.
In 5 years' time, we'll need to replace it anyway, so we can replace it in a more secure way. And for a company, I think it's very difficult. CISOs could spend almost the whole operating budget of the company if you let them. So finding out where do you get the biggest return? The approach I took when I was in the Cabinet Office and we were looking at investment in response to the terrorist threat was a combination of minimax and maxi-min. So you want to minimize the maximum harm an adversary could do to you. But you can only afford to do a little bit of that. Obviously, we secured nuclear power stations, for example, but very expensive to do, but you can do it. But you can't do that for everything. You secure airports, but you can't secure railway stations in the same way, just too difficult or too expensive. So the other part of it is maxi-min, which is maximizing the minimum level of assurance you can give that, yeah, if something happens, normal life can be resumed pretty quickly. So, I mean, my advice would be look for the spikes of risk and see if you can actually afford to flatten those.
Yeah.
But most of it is about hygiene. It's about raising employee awareness, training, running exercises, replacing really out-of-date, unsupported software so that there's nothing in the system that the automated detectors that the criminals are using that would come around and say, aha, this company is now using a Microsoft version which is no longer supported. We know how to get into that kind of operating system. You stand out, you know, it's kind of red flag or green flag to the criminals saying, come and get us, because we are not properly defended. And you mentioned WannaCry. I mean, that was one of the problems, was so much embedded equipment that had unsupported software.
Yeah.
No, we should be demanding of the manufacturers that scanners and X-ray machines and so on, they have upgradable software. And I would hope these days that that is the case.
I think that's one thing that was spoken about actually at that event last week. In the US, they are trying to take the approach, and I think the EU are doing it as well, of shifting that responsibility upstream. So, you know, secure by design is a simple concept, but you know, there's still a lot of manufacturing, particularly things like IoT, small devices, Wi-Fi routers, things that there's millions of around our homes and in different organizations, with, you know, as you say, unupgradable software or cheap software or embedded passwords and stuff like that, and it's a major problem. So trying to shift that upstream, so organizations shouldn't have to spend their time fixing somebody else's software. Like, why should an organization have to vulnerability scan, you know, a very expensive piece of software and come back and say, I found all these bugs? That responsibility should be further upstream. I think that's it's a critical approach, really, because otherwise I don't really think we can succeed, because it's just impossible with the volume of potential vulnerabilities across, multiplied by the amount of software out there.
It's one of those areas, though, where you can certainly see the case for regulation.
Yeah. 100%.
You mentioned, you know, Internet of Things objects, so baby alarms, video cameras that automatically upload your material and so on.
Internet and hack them trivially. They're not very well protected.
You should, you know, certainly for the UK, you can't now import such devices without having, you know, some basic security, including the ability to upgrade the security as and when problems arise. The big wake-up call was the use of baby alarms, the baby video monitors and so on, being hacked into by paedophile groups, which is, when you think about it, just so horrendous.
Horrific,
imagine, you know, the parent of, you know, an infant, and you discover that somebody on the other side of the world has been hacking in to your baby's kind of picture that you. So that's a case where I think we just have to say, no, it's better to regulate, because if you don't regulate, then the incentive on some companies just to slip stuff through will be so strong. Whereas if everybody's in the same level playing field, if you regulate.
Yeah, I think I heard a good analogy in that discussion from someone, I'm trying to recall who, but you know, we've developed extremely good track, trace, and regulation around food. You know, if there's an outbreak of foot and mouth, or there's a or there's an issue with a bird flu in a farm in northeastern Belgium, we can isolate the entire chain of where all that food has gone within, I think it's actually minutes at this point, with the systems that are there. Why wouldn't we have something similar for baby monitors or software in general? We should be able to have we should have the same kind of regulation around software as we do around food. Considering how much software pervades our lives. So I thought that was an interesting way of looking at it. The other bit that you're maxing in, I like that piece. So when we talk to organizations, when I talk to organizations, one of the first things we always ask is, what are your crown jewels? What are your key elements? What is your nuclear power station? What is the bits that if they're gone, you're gone? And let's take the Pareto principle and spend 80% of our budget on protecting those. But then the flip side on the basic security hygiene piece, simple. So many organizations still fail at simple stuff. Like upgrading the software is actually quite hard, and that goes back to the conversation we just had. That probably should be pushed upstream, and there should be less responsibility, because that is a very difficult thing to do for organizations, to change management around that. But things like multi-factor authentication and basic scanning of your network and understanding what your normal looks like, and this is baselining, and then just reporting on the exceptions. I thought a really great line from a cybersecurity researcher that I heard recently was, criminals are lazy. They're not looking for a challenge. They're not looking to solve the puzzle and hack the hardest network in the world. They want to make money. They're criminals because they want the easier path. So it's the path of least resistance. So if you don't put the effort in, and you have poor security hygiene, and you don't do other things, you're the obvious target. It's kind of like if you're the house that has the security alarm and the locks on your windows, they'll move to the next house because it's too difficult, even though it's breaking those things. That doesn't apply for state and maybe some of those more elements, but I think it's quite important for a lot of organizations. Is cybercrime is still the biggest problem. I think the nation state side of things is a lot tougher.
No, I'm sure that's right. That's absolutely right. And of course, the criminals now have some quite advanced tools.
Yeah.
So they are able to, scan and establish which version of software you're using, for example. And my fear is that large language models, AI, is going to make it, it's going to, in some ways, it will help the cybersecurity guys, but probably it will also help the criminals.
Yeah.
They can write malware or tune up malware, which the AI can help them do very much more easily than having to find the one guy who's really, really good at that, because the machines can help with it. And automated scanning, looking for vulnerabilities. Once you've found a vulnerability, finding out who else, in the corporate world, has systems which are susceptible to that vulnerability. So taking in a large amount of information and then condensing it for the criminals. And we're already seeing, of course, that the criminal world, the hacker world has become specialized.
Yeah.
So it's not the case that you just have a hacker group like the
guy in a hoodie,
our evil group in Russia doing it all. You've got specialists at getting into the network.
Yeah, and hackers for hire. You don't have to be technical
who will
yourself.
Sell that part of it. Other specialists will provide the software, the malware. Yet others will provide exit routes, or in the case of ransomware, routes for laundering the money. So it's a whole ecosystem, and it's quite interesting. There was a white paper on ransomware came out quite recently from the UK National Crime Agency and the National Security Cybersecurity Agency, a sort of joint white paper describing the ecosystem and saying that probably that's the weakest point of the criminals, is working together in this ecosystem. So if you can start to knock down some of the elements that they use, rather than simply saying an attack has taken place, let's now, in a classic law enforcement way, investigate this crime as one crime. That's not going to get you very far.
Yeah,
So
I think if
they
it's more
get
the way
more
they try to take down
sophisticated
international gangs and stuff is the approach. Yeah.
Yeah, the ecosystem, and they've had some successes. The white paper, it's on the web. It's well worth having a look at.
Yeah, like I've always been fascinated that they have full call centers with, you know, sophisticated call center software, because it's a cash rich and relatively lower risk criminal industry to be in for a lot of these criminal gangs. I think I remember, might have been in that paper, another one, there's been a massive shift of what used to be purely drugs and people trafficking gangs into cybercrime, because it's so profitable and it's so much less there's so much less risk that they take on board to do it. They can use that to fund other activities or to augment other activities. So it's but it's become very.
And if you do get caught as a white collar criminal,
yeah,
you can get treated, I'm afraid, differently than if you're the guy with a mask on and a sawn-off shotgun.
Yeah, and there isn't even the same extradition rules, or, you know, you've got the attribution thing. If I'm attacking, can you prove what country I came from and where I'm based now? And how, you know, it's much harder to do those. So I think it is a lower risk. But I suppose just conscious that we're coming near the end of the chat. I could do this all day, to be honest. It's been fascinating. I just want to ask Clara, have we any questions come in from the audience during the session?
No, all good there.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, so we either put them all to sleep or all their questions were answered in the discussion. I would just like to put this up on screen now, just to let everyone know we are offering some free copies of David's book, and also signed copies to the first couple of people who register with a session with ourselves. Let me just share that on screen. Find the button. There we are. Hopefully you can all see that. Yep. So there's a QR code there. I promise it's not a trap. I'm always wary when we use QR codes because they are risky. But if you want to register for a consultation with myself or one of the team, the first I think it's 5 or 10 people will win a copy of David's book. I have to say, it's fascinating and extremely interesting. I'm also interested in reading your other book about the spy world. That's something I was raised on Robert Ludlum and Len Dayton books as a kid, so it's an area that I'm quite interested in learning more about. And from my side, David, it's been an absolute joy of a conversation. I really could have kept going all day, and really want to thank you so much for the time that you've given over to us.
Well, thank you, Paul. It's been a great conversation. I've enjoyed it very much, and I can only wish you and the company and the whole sector good luck in trying to keep us safe.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a much bigger piece of work than that, and there's a lot of stuff we spoke about today that I think is going to be top of mind for organizations over the next while. I'm a big believer that regulation is going to help. I think the NIS2 directive in Europe is going to be a big driver, and the equivalents in other jurisdictions. But there's a lot of work to do, I think, to get everyone up to a good baseline. So hopefully some of the items that you've covered in the book, either directly around the cyberspace or in general, can help organizations do that. So thank you very much. And I'd like to thank the audience for today. We were trying to do more of these series over the next couple of weeks and months, so we'll keep you notified of any future sessions. And thank you very much for your time.